Well, it's very nice of you all to come out this evening. It's quite a big turnout for this seminar. I appreciate it. As most of you know, I'm Leslie Henninger, and I'm a pilot examiner in the area. I've been doing that for about 10 years. And my history as far as aviation goes back about 25 years, and maybe about 23 years ago I got my multi-engine rating. Shortly after that, I got my multi-instructor rating. So with about 40 hours, I was out giving dual in multi-engine airplanes, which is kind of a scary idea when you think about it. But that's the position a lot of instructors find themselves in. So we are going to talk today about the training and what's involved in it and what dangers there are, and perhaps give you some insight as to some better ways to do things. Primarily, though, I'm going to go through the test as I give it. And, here they are. And most people, just to summarize why most people are involved in multi-engine training, I'd say most of the people taking tests now are doing it for career advancement. So they're trying to get the multi-engine time to get into the airlines. Another reason people might be in multi-engine training is just for a new challenge, or perhaps a customer of yours, if you're an instructor, has bought a multi-engine airplane and needs the rating. Instructors, as we know, are trying to build multi-engine time, so that's a major goal for a lot of people. And the goal of everybody in the room is to probably pass a flight test. How many of you are students in this process? Okay, and how many are instructors? Okay, it's about half and half then. So we have to remember that the goal isn't just to pass the test. The goal is to save your life in the event of a multi-engine mishap, an engine failure in a critical situation, or to at least save the aircraft and your life if possible. So that's part of the goal of the training, and that's what the instructor should be focusing on. There's some problems in the training environment because it's kind of a dangerous business. The structure of the training focuses mainly on engine failures and problems. So instructors spend a lot of time simulating problems or creating problems where none exist. So this is a fairly dangerous activity, and every year we hear about accidents, especially in training, where people have lost their lives. There was one this year that I know of personally where 3 people died in a multi-engine training accident. Brand new aircraft, so it was hard to imagine that it was an equipment problem, and the way it was described, they probably Vmc'd and lost control of the airplane. And 3 people killed, including one who was just watching from the back seat. So these things have gotten my attention over the years, and in addition to that, there's been some evolution in the theory behind how the training should be done and some of the actual multi-engine principles. So we're going to talk about some of these things. One of the problems with training is that we are trying to simulate things that happen in reality in artificial situations. So we're trying to create or mimic a situation that your student might find himself in someday, and you want him to be able to work his way out of that. We are limited in the ability to do this, and we're limited primarily to focusing on the complete and total engine failure, when most of our problems really aren't complete and total sudden engine failures the way that we experience them for multi-engine training. These are artificial scenarios, and people tend to develop rote behaviors to respond to certain situations. One of the weaknesses I see in applicants is that occasionally they're trained to bring out a rote behavior given a certain situation that they anticipate the examiner doing. So I think the training might actually sound something like this. Okay, now Leslie's going to shut off the fuel selector at this point, and you will do thus and so. And then the problem with that kind of training is that they always get confused. If they really learn just the rote behavior, then they are likely to bring out the wrong rote behavior for a given situation that I'm trying to simulate. So we want to get beyond the rote behavior and get a little understanding behind what it is that we're trying to get them to accomplish. There's also a lot of room while you're doing multi-engine training for misunderstandings in the cockpit. That's why we should always brief every flight and say exactly what's going to happen on the flight. And once you start generating scenarios for your students, you want to be sure that they know exactly the kind of thing that you're going to be doing. There also should be agreement on who's going to continue to fly the airplane, who's going to be pilot in command if something happens for real. Now these artificial situations sometimes can lead to real problems. So if we feather a prop, we may end up with that prop being feathered all the way to the ground. So we should be prepared to, first of all, be able to restart the airplane in flight, and secondly, be able to handle the emergency if it really evolves. When you create an artificial problem in the cockpit, you also run the risk of having some real problems show up at the same time. I had a Baron Checkride one time where we had a throttle cable break while we were in the middle of a single engine landing. And it fails in the full throttle position, which was really nice to find out. So we had to first sort out what's going on, and there's many seconds of confusion sitting there. So we ultimately figured out what was going on, terminated the scenario where we had the engine failure, and sorted out what we were going to do. And I always agree with the applicant beforehand that he's going to keep flying the airplane if possible. And in fact, that applicant was able to finish his check ride because I let him fly the airplane. So you just have to be alert to these things because it can be very confusing. So let's begin with discussing some of the material that we're going to have on the oral. And I'm just going to run through this. If everybody can see that fairly well. As with every flight test, we're always going to have to prove the airworthiness of the airplane. So I'm not going to bother running through all that detail with you because you understand that. You just have to present the records because I truly can't get in an airplane where I don't know for a fact that it's airworthy. Otherwise, I could lose my certificate if somebody from the FAA shows up or if there was any incident. We'll go into systems probably first, and always the landing gear system is an interesting discussion point. So you have to understand the landing gear in the emergency situations and what to do if the gear fails. And in the case of those people flying Aztecs and Apaches, you have to understand that the landing gear is going to have to be manually extended if you have a left feathered engine. So this can be a discussion point, will be a discussion point, I'm sure, with all examiners. After that, I'd be going into the propellers. Now, this is a significant topic because maybe people have their commercial rating and they have some idea of what a constant speed prop does, but it's also possible that they didn't really pick up too much about that. But at least we're getting the full feathering element in the twins, so we talk quite a bit about the props. The big problem with these constant speed props is that it hides a lot of problems from the pilots as far as partial power losses. So when I have instructors do a multi-engine instructor check ride, I usually have them teach me the propeller system. Private or commercial pilot, if he understands the propeller system and can go into some of the detail on the prop system, you can certainly give me all that information, and it's nice to know that you've got that available. But the interesting things about the prop is to figure out how the constant speed prop is going to interfere with your interpreting the gauges. So a student might ask the question, what gauge should I look at to figure out which engine is failing? And the answer is there probably isn't a really good gauge for that. So we'll talk about it in the oral and discuss these various gauges and how they'd be useful. So question would be asked, how will you adjust the mixture in cruise flight? And if you're a student or you say that you're going to adjust it until you see a loss of RPMs, it suggests to me that you don't understand the constant speed prop. So understand that the EGT is probably your best bet as far as how to lean the mixture, and understand how to use the EGT. Carburetor icing, will that show up on any gauges? Well, it will show up on a manifold pressure gauge because the ice has the effect of closing the throttle. So it's very similar to having just pulled the throttle closed when the ice develops. So you can see carb ice, but it'd be a slow progression. Again, the constant speed prop is going to hide that, and so that would be concealed from you. If you get a magneto failure in cruise flight, will that show up on any gauges? And usually by this time, people understand that you can't see the RPM change in cruise flight. So then they might want to say the manifold pressure, but that's not going to change either because you really haven't changed the flow of air through the engine. So where do you see this? Well, it actually shows up on the EGT, should you have working EGTs. And we all know who I'm talking to. If you have working EGTs, the EGT will rise immediately. And if you don't have working EGTs, you may not notice it. And since the engines are out on the wings, you really don't feel or hear the loss, the engine roughness that you might feel with a single engine airplane. So and the reason the EGT goes up is because it takes a little longer to burn the fuel if you're using only one spark plug. So it burns as it's exiting, and so the exhaust gas temperature will rise immediately. Next time you do a run-up in a plane that has a working EGT, you can see the EGT go up as soon as you do a mag check. So you can check me out on that one. It goes up immediately. In fact, the EGT turns out to be one of the better gauges for evaluating a power loss. Now for commercial, maybe, and for flight instructors for sure, I would be asking, well, when we do a run-up on the ground, we look at the RPMs to see if the mags are working or if the carb heat is working. We look for a loss of RPMs. Why does that work on the ground? Well, that works because the prop is full forward, and therefore you've made a fixed pitch prop out of it. The prop, when it slows down, the governor would be trying to flatten the blades, and it can flatten the blades because they're at the flattest pitch stop. So that's why you can adjust or you can see a mag loss on the RPM gauge during a run-up. Additionally, if you were taking off in a high-density altitude situation, you could lean the mixtures for takeoff using an RPM drop or peak RPM for takeoff because the prop is a fixed pitch prop, so the RPMs will be just like a fixed pitch prop there. You could also use the EGT for takeoff at high altitude. Okay, so what's the manifold pressure on a feathered engine? Atmospheric. Some people like to think that it'd be 0, but it's not going to be. While the engine's still windmilling, the manifold pressure is going to read about where the throttle is set. So you can move, even if the engine has failed, you can change the manifold pressure by moving the throttle, but you haven't changed anything about the power because the engine is in fact feathered. Another way to ask this question is when you start the airplane, does the manifold pressure go up or down? Well, since it starts at atmospheric, the manifold pressure actually goes down because it's kind of manifold suction and not manifold pressure. But there's some good articles out there about the manifold pressure gauge. And you can go into some detail on that if you want. Fuel pressure gauge. Can you have fuel pressure on an engine that's not developing power? Well, anything that has a fuel pump, you have fuel pressure on it when you're starting the airplane. The engines aren't running. You turn on the pumps, there's fuel pressure. Doesn't mean there's power on the engine. So the fuel pressure gauge may or may not be an indication but certainly is unreliable for whether or not you're producing power. Oil pressure, same sort of thing. If the engine is windmilling, you're still going to have oil pressure because that's just measured as the engine is turning over. There's a measure of pressure. Certainly once it's feathered, but then of course you know which engine is not running. The oil pressure and the fuel pressure probably will go away, especially if you do the full secure. Cylinder head temperature. Over the long term, the cylinder head temperature will change, but not quickly enough for you to determine which engine is failing in a critical situation. The EGT, as I said, is one of the good indicators because it will change almost immediately as soon as combustion ceases. So that, I don't really know anybody who's looking at EGTs to see which engine has failed, so that's not that reliable either. So pretty much now we've exhausted looking at all the possible gauges to determine which engine has failed. Now we all know dead foot, dead engine, but the question is, if you're in the clouds and you have an engine failure while you're in a turn, I guarantee you're going to be confused. I've seen people do this. I've seen people be confused even when they're not in the clouds. So I'll ask, how are you going to know which engine has failed if you're confused and in the clouds? So the only really reliable gauge on the plane is the ball. And so if you're in the clouds and confused about what to do with your feet, you would step on the ball, and then you know the other engine is dead. So, and people can get crossed up on the control input, because believe it or not, you can make the airplane go straight by using aileron like this and the incorrect rudder. And it goes straight. It's going down, but it's going straight as far as heading goes. But clearly it's in a big slip, and it'll feel pretty uncomfortable, but to a student or somebody who's very startled in the clouds, it could be confusing. So when in doubt, you always want to look at the ball to decide what to do with your feet. Okay, so that's the propeller is an interesting subject because of that, and that pretty much covers everything I would ask on that. Fuel systems, you'll find that most of today's material is based on the Seminole. I am qualified in all the twins that are used for training around here. But just to simplify the exhibits, I just selected the Seminole. So it's a pretty simple fuel system, but other planes have a more complicated fuel system like the 310. There's certainly a lot to discuss with that. So the fuel system is always going to be discussed on an airplane, at least to cover the cross-feed situation. So you should have a relatively good grasp on how to cross-feed an engine when I give you a scenario where you need to do that. You could also say, and everybody should, look at the checklist to verify. So you can always say, I'll look at the checklist, but this is my recollection of how to cross-feed. Electrical problems. All these planes have 2 alternators, so electrical problems don't get critical as quickly as they do in a single-engine airplane. So understand the redundancy and be able to discuss what you would do if you detected, how you would detect an engine or electrical problem and what you would do about it. I've been somewhat surprised. The vacuum system's pretty simple. All you need to know is there's 2 pumps and a gauge. But I asked the question because in a Piper, the light that lights up says VAC. And I've had ATPs not know what VAC means for some reason. It just escapes them. So you have to know what those annunciator lights mean when they light up. So if VAC lights up, you tell me that you're going to look at the gauge and find out which button has popped out and verify that you still have suction. Because the light could be on for one pump being bad or both pumps being bad. Pedostatic, the trick Piper question is, where is the static source? So the Cessna pilots who jump into the Seminole for the first time may not be aware of where the static source is. It's on the back of the pitot mast. So we need to know where that is. Otherwise, you've been pre-flighting the airplane and you want instrument privileges and you may not know where the static source is. So that would be an area of weakness that you could easily avoid. What can you do if you have a blockage of the pitot or the static source? The answer is you have alternate static. You should know where that is and how to activate it. You should also know that you're left with some error. The Piper manual and perhaps the others, I'm not sure, tell you how to minimize the error in the alternate static source. Basically, you're trying to pressurize the cockpit to have as much pressure as the outside or as close as you can get. But you're going to be left with some error anyway, and I think the only important thing to know about that is that the error that you're left with would leave you in greater danger if you believed the gauges, because it's telling you you're higher than you are and you're going faster than you are. So the important thing to remember is you're in greater danger if you're using alternate static. And also you should know that there's pitot heat, which would probably be the only solution for a pitot clog problem in flight. And that would lead me into asking you if there's any other anti or de-ice equipment on the airplane. And there aren't too many planes around here being used for training that have boots, but some of them have electric props and alcohol props. So be familiar with the anti or de-ice equipment, even if you've been doing your training in the summer. Cabin heater is always a major issue because they are dangerous, and there's ADs on all of them that I know of in the light twins, because what they're doing is they're burning gasoline in the front of the airplane. Kind of a dangerous concept when you think about it. They all have overheat protection where they shut down and you can't restart it when it's overheated. But of course that could fail. And the manuals all tell you, first of all, how much fuel they burn and how to keep it from overheating. Generally it means keep the vent open for 15 seconds in flight and keep the fan running for a couple minutes on the ground. And that will cool them off so you don't get an overheat problem. But remember, once it's overheated and it pops the circuit breaker, then you're stuck with no heat. Okay, that would cover performance or systems pretty well. Anybody here working on an ATP or thinking about that? Okay, well, systems, all of you, I know, eventually. But systems is one of the major elements for the ATP discussion. The ATP oral is actually one of the easiest to administer because we don't talk about theory, we don't talk about critical engine, we don't talk about any of that stuff. We talk about how to handle emergencies and systems and performance. So we'll move on to performance now. All right, so you'll be able to do a weight and balance problem before I show up, and you also will know the data for your day, the weather, so you can compute the performance for the airplane, which will save you the effort of showing me how to do it. And you can have all the graphs printed up. Best thing to do is blow up the graph that's in the little book and bring a whole set of them that are pre-marked with today's flight data. That really shortens the time it takes to look at that information and allows you to get a head start on the oral material. As far as the weight and balance, what I've plotted there with the green is the takeoff and the zero fuel weight. You're always going to be asked to do a weight shift, and usually zero fuel weight is adequate for having done a weight shift and a CG shift. The blue X there represents my question of what if I sat in the back seat? And the question is, did things get better or worse or stay the same for you if I sat in the back seat? And I'm not talking about my skill and ability to help you with the emergency. But if you had an engine failure on liftoff, the rear CG actually causes you to have a shorter arm to the rudder, making the rudder less effective. So you could be pushing as hard on the rudder with the blue X position and not getting the same results as you would if you had the forward CG. That goes to the VMC variables, and one of them is CG. I don't ask you to do the list of 8 things that are used to certify the airplane because it's kind of boring and rote, but I do ask you to interpret how this would affect you at various places during the flight. So this is one of those. So have your, you can put another example up there. You can compute the data for the day in question, however you want to set it up. Work out your own system for having this pre-flight planning done. Okay, now after we do a day that's fairly pleasant, until it gets really hot in the summer here, I'm going to give you another problem to work out, so it gives you a little something more to think about, giving you some density altitude considerations. So I've given you a 3,000-foot runway, which, you know, a single engine pilot thinks is a fairly long runway, and a 2,000-foot elevation. It's not Denver, so I didn't go that far, but it's still pretty high. But you might be thinking, yeah, it's not that high, you know. And the pressure is 2982 because most of the graphs are going to ask for pressure altitude. Interestingly enough, pilots at all levels are a little unclear on how to figure out pressure altitude. So I think you should be able to do it. And just remember, if the pressure is lower than standard, it's mimicking a higher altitude. So everybody can do the math to figure out that's 100 feet. And then it's a 2,100 foot pressure altitude for this airport. And the temperature is 30 degrees C. And we're about done with those temperatures for this year. But we'll see them again, I'm sure. And zero wind, just to make it interesting. Okay. Now, I'll ask you what information you think you need to know to plan a takeoff on this runway. And you're going to have to make a takeoff decision, because you're not always going to have your 6,000 foot runway. Then you'll be asked, or you might be tempted to go in and out of a field like this. So we have to know if your decision making is going to be in place. So the first thing you might want to know is the takeoff ground roll. Okay, and this is the Piper graph. And you can see that we plotted the temperature at 30 degrees C, and we went up to roughly 2,100 foot. I apparently went a little too high there, but 2,100 foot pressure altitude over the reference line, down to the weight. I used 3,600 pounds there. And straight across, if there was wind at this point, you'd be going obviously down for headwind and up for tailwind. So we just go straight across and we end up with a 1,500 foot ground roll. Seems okay for this runway, so we move on. But remember the 1,500 feet, it comes up again later. So then, well, everybody wants to know if there's trees at this airport. And I say, well, there's some trees, but they're perhaps not quite at the end of the runway. That leaves me a little latitude to change the question. But anyway, there's trees, but they're not right at the end of the runway. So when we do the takeoff distance over a 50-foot obstacle short field effort, we find that it's 2850. So some pilots would say, well, that's okay if the trees are maybe 500 feet off the end of the runway. Or I might even put them farther if the pilot's looking nervous, because I want to get him farther into this problem. So that's getting us a little concerned about the takeoff, but we still have the engine failure considerations. So now the pilot obviously needs to know that accelerate stop distance is important. Accelerate stop is the distance to accelerate to rotation speed in these airplanes, and then come to a stop. And this is obviously, you know, all these graphs Piper and everybody did. They want the planes to look good. They want them to, you know, sell. So there's no reaction time. And of course, the test pilot knew that the engine was going to fail at 75. In fact, he just pulled the throttles back at 75 and got on the brakes. So now, for our problem at this high altitude airport, we see that the accelerate stop distance is greater than the runway length. Well, most people say, oh, I'm not going to go at this point. Well, if they're not going to go, then I'm going to talk about the foolish pilot who might want to go, because we need to talk about accelerate go. Or if he's nervous and perhaps thinking, well, perhaps I could go if I'm feeling lucky today, I might say, all right, well, maybe what we should do is if the engine fails at rotation speed, maybe we should take off. Not that people think that in these light twins, but I suppose there have been some accidents where that happens. So now we need to think about accelerate and go. But let's back up. Now, Piper actually has taken this accelerate stop distance out of the new Piper manuals. So the 2000 model doesn't even have an accelerate stop distance. They don't want to be liable for anything. So this graph has disappeared out of the new manual. So what can we do if we want to figure out accelerated stop distance? Well, we could take the takeoff ground roll, which was 1,500 feet, and add it to the landing ground roll. And this came up to about 820, 30 feet. For some reason, when you add these two together, logically it seems like it should come up with the accelerated stop distance, but it's always less for some reason. Perhaps because they figure your touchdown isn't happening at 75, maybe it's happening slower on the short field landing. So I don't know, but that's one way at least you can get an estimate of what the accelerated stop distance would be. Takeoff ground roll plus the landing ground roll. Okay, another thing clearly important to us is the climb performance single engine. Now we know they don't climb well, single engine, but on this particular day, it's not climbing very well at all. So on this day, this airplane, this Piper, will get less than 100 feet rate of climb per minute. And that's in a perfect world, because we have to pay attention here to the, before I get into that. Why do you get such poor performance? If this airplane's climbing 1,000 feet a minute on 2 engines, why is it climbing only 80 on 1? Because it's half the horsepower, right? A lot of people say, well, it's all the drag. No, it's not really all the drag because it's still the same airplane. Here's the reason. What you're losing is your climb performance. So if this Piper or any similar airplane has 280 horsepower engines, and it's 360, it takes horsepower to stay level. So let's say it takes about 150 horsepower to stay level, which leaves you 210 to climb. This will give you a great climb performance, 1,000 feet a minute. But if you take an engine off of that, you're left with 30 horsepower to climb. So you can see how your performance, your climb performance, has been reduced by 80% or thereabouts. So it's not overall performance, it's your ability to climb. And is everybody clear on that? You all can ask questions whenever you want to. But I think making this calculation helps people understand what it is they're losing when they lose that engine. The second engine is almost entirely devoted to climb performance. All right, going back on our single engine climb performance, I'll ask the pilot who calculates this. All right, if you get airborne and you're doing 80, as the plane typically is as you get airborne, are you getting 80 feet per minute if the engine fails? And the answer is absolutely not. You are getting far less than that, and we'll work our way through what you're actually hoping to get. We have to pay attention to these conditions up here. They want wing flaps 0, and the new Piper manuals don't suggest taking off with any flaps, and I would not suggest anybody taking off with flaps because of the drag considerations if you have an engine failure. So they do say that your flaps are 0. And cowl flaps, this is an interesting one. The operating engine is supposed to be open, which it was for takeoff, and the in-op engine is supposed to be closed. Now, I can't imagine who would be actually closing the cowl flap while you're climbing out on upland, but I suppose it gave them a couple more feet per minute, so they closed one of the cowl flaps. It's not a realistic expectation, and it would be just a horrible distraction to try to do that. And the landing gear has to be up, and mixture full rich. We'll talk about that. And the prop has to be feathered. The tower has to be full throttle. And airspeed 8 gauge. In addition, you have to have 2 to 3 degrees bank towards the operating engine. Just take a moment and talk about that. So I'd ask you, why do we have to have this bank towards the operating engine? And you can find one of these pictures in any of these multi-engine books. You can make the airplane go straight by keeping the ball centered and the wings level as you see on this side. But as you can see, the relative wind is hitting this side of the fuselage, which creates a huge amount of drag. So the bank and the ball shouldn't be that far out. Half a ball is the best way to get 0 side slip. Now, instructors, if you want to prove the 0 side slip concept, you can put a piece of yarn on the windshield and use it as a yaw string, so you can see how much bank it takes to keep the yaw string going straight. And it's also a very good visual because it's hard to imagine this side slip condition versus the 0 side slip. So I did have an engineer bring to a test one time an engineering study that proved that the perfect bank in a Piper is 2.1 degrees of bank. So ever since then, I've been looking for the pilot who can fly 2.1 degrees of bank. under these emergency conditions, which is hard to do. Well, you did it, I think. But 5 degrees, which a lot of people would say, well, 5 degrees of bank. 5 degrees was a certification limit. That was the only reason 5 degrees ever came into the picture. So it's 2 to 5 degrees of bank towards the operating engine. All right, so let's start figuring out what might happen if, say, the landing gear wasn't up. Well, in your drag demonstration, you're going to find out that the landing gear is going to cost you 250 feet per minute. So that's definitely going to detract from this 80. We're going downhill pretty good at this point. And if the prop's not feathered, one of the unfortunate things in the new Piper manual is that they say the prop not being feathered, the windmilling prop, costs you 200 feet. I don't know who wrote that. I think it's a typo. The marketing department probably doesn't understand well enough to lie. It's 400 feet if it's a foot, because obviously I think the windmilling prop, its profile is far greater than the gear. So we know intuitively that the prop has to cost you more in performance than the landing gear. So with the, and who knows about the cowl flap, but with the landing gear down and the prop not feathered, you're going down at 650 minus the 80, or you're going down and you're going to be touching the ground pretty soon. Now, presumably, if you elected to keep flying, the gear was up, but that prop is still a big problem out there and will be for a number of seconds. So we're going to get back to some of these single-engine climb situations, but we'd also talk about cruise performance, and you would just have to look up for a sample situation, 5,000 feet, combination of manifold pressure. This confuses some people who are not that familiar with light piston twins. A lot of the military guys say that this Seminole will fly for 10 hours because they divide 10, but it's per engine, so we have to remember to double that figure. So it's about a 5-hour airplane, and you'll have to know that. Now this is the graph that most people have trouble with. Speed power graph for the Piper. Unfortunately, the example they give us, they're reading the outside air temperature gauge. When you're doing your pre-flight planning, you're dealing with the temperature you know to be on the ground. So the example I've given here looks to be, we know the temperature was 30 at about, looks like 1,800 feet. So you have to go up to the elevation that you're at, and then you slide over here for the standard lapse rate. Or else you could just compute what the temperature would be at 5,000 feet and go straight up to there and then over. Does everybody understand how that works? Okay. But people miss the straight up part. Some days you don't have a straight up part because you start over here and you're already at your field elevation. But that one gives people some trouble. I've never given anybody a pink slip over it, but it'd be nice if you got it right. I'm always delighted by that. Okay, so we need to talk about accelerate go. Now, most of the manufacturers are not happy to put this in there because it never looks too good. So here's the Beechcraft Duchess. And a typical day around here would be like this purple line. And if you read the notes, they say whenever you get into this shaded area, you may not be climbing. So that's something to worry about. It's a big warning area right there. On the day that my high density altitude problem, we're way off the graph. They don't even want to talk about what happens at those altitudes. So you can see these numbers get really big when you start to figure accelerate go. But how can we figure this out if they don't give us this information? So we put a lot of thought into this. And we'll get into that in some detail. All right, at that point, we're pretty much finished with the performance part of the oral, and we would move into having you describe a normal takeoff. And this is easy for people to do. They know how they line up on the runway, hold the brakes, run the power up, check the gauges, accelerate to VR 75 in the Seminole, rotate, climb out at blue line, gear up. The most important thing about this discussion right now is, when do you put the gear up? And the answer is, you put the gear up when you could no longer land on the available landing surfaces. And let's not forget that you have other runways available to you at a lot of these airports. So if you took off on 27 at Aurora, you could potentially land on 33. It's quite a bit of 33 out there. There was a really nice maneuver executed at Pewaukee by the good people up there. They took off and had an engine failure on liftoff off of the short runway, but they made a turn onto the longer runway and put the airplane down beautifully, saved the airplane instead of putting it in the trees. So think about all your options, make your briefings for takeoff very specific to the airport, and consider other runways as part of your option. But the basic story on when to put the gear up is whenever you're committed to fly the airplane, even if you had an engine failure. And typically people say, that's when I perceive that I could not land straight ahead. It doesn't mean when you run out of runway, it means when you perceive that you couldn't land straight ahead. So that is the landmark for you making the decision to fly. And this is where your procedures would change from re-landing the airplane to commitment to fly. So this is a mental landmark for you, and a very important one. So after we've discussed the normal takeoff profile, I'll ask the question, how will you handle problems on takeoff? And I picked the word problems because I want to avoid specifically addressing engine failures. The training, unfortunately, has probably focused mostly on engine failures. Now, is there anyone in the room who has had a total sudden engine failure instantaneously in any airplane? Okay, no hands. Has anybody suffered a partial power loss? Not too many. See, we're all pretty lucky. But I can tell you partial power loss is due to a magneto problem or a stuck valve or something like that are far more common than a sudden, complete, total engine failure. So we need to be training for not only the sudden and complete fuel starvation, the pilot misplanned or didn't switch tanks type of engine failure that we're simulating, and think about other kinds of problems. So when you discuss, and this is kind of your pre-takeoff briefing that we're doing on the ground, when you discuss engine or problems on takeoff, I want you to kind of address all the possible problems. Many pilots will say, well, if I have an engine failure before rotation, I'm going to pull the power and stop straight ahead. Then I have to ask, well, what if there's a kid screaming in your ear in the back seat? Well, I'm going to pull the power and stop. Well, what if the door is open? I'm going to pull the power and stop. So really what it boils down to is anything, any anomaly before rotation speed, you're going to pull the power and stop. So you may as well just view it that way. Any anomaly, anything that seems wrong, you stop. The classic example on a Checkride where a pilot didn't get the point was we're rolling down the runway and it was an ATP applicant, so he had to do an abort. So I said, I smell smoke. He said, I don't, and continued the takeoff. I didn't think it was good crew resource management. So you don't want him to be your co-pilot. He didn't do too well in the rest of the flight either. Anyway, could be anything that causes you to stop before you take off. Next question is this area of decision here. Question is, when do you put the gear up? Well, if you perceive you can't land straight ahead, you're going to put the gear up, and then you're committed to fly the airplane. Before that, if the gear is still down, you have actively selected landing instead of flying the airplane. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what we should do if that's our decision. Okay. Now, so here's the pilot re-landing the airplane because the gear was still down. It does look like he's going to hit the tree, but it may be another situation too. Could be that he's just made the decision that this airplane can't climb single engine, and he's going to put the plane back down as a result of having made a bad decision to take off. But the question remains, if you do have obstructions at the end of the runway or a little bit beyond it, you may run off the runway. You have to make the decision, if this happens to you right at the moment where you have to make the decision, you have to decide whether you'd rather run into the tree or try to dodge the tree on the ground going 10 or 20, or would you like to hit the tree potentially upside down at 50 feet in the air going 80, 50, 70 and fall and die. So you want to develop in your students a recognition that taking the fence at the end of the runway might be more desirable than trying to fly the airplane, especially on a really bad day. Because you can probably live through the landing, but not through crashing into the tree at at some altitude above the ground. So that's one of your considerations. Now we have the situation about the nice theoretical picture that they gave us to begin with, where we can, and this is sort of a kind of a pie in the sky type picture. They suggest here that at the moment of decision, this airplane, if the engine failed here, he just flew right over the tree. In fact, we already figured out that if it was the Seminole at that airport I described earlier, it's going downhill. So this diagram is a little misleading unless it's a Baron or a 310 that's lightly loaded. It's possible you could fly off like that, but not too likely. So how are we going to fly this airplane on upwind to do our very best? We're going to get into a discussion here that goes a little off the beaten path, out of the mainstream on how to fly the airplane. But I've seen lots and lots of check rides, and I've watched a lot of people do this engine failure simulation at altitude. And since I'm at altitude, I don't have to worry about the ground. I'm able to see what the best technique is for flying the airplane when you have the engine failure after you put the gear up. And some of the answers are going to be a little surprising here. So I've prepared the perfect upwind if you have an engine failure. Now, a lot of this is inconsistent with what a lot of people say. I'm going to give you my reasons, and we'll discuss. And that's not to say that this is the only way I would accept this being done, because it's a practical test. So whatever you do, if you stay within the parameters, you will pass the test. So in a perfect world, this would be perhaps the best way to do handle the situation. So the engine fails, obviously we maintain directional control. We want the best speed. Now there's room for a lot of discussion on this. How many people would say blue line at this point? Or now you're reluctant to raise your hands. Well, I'd say 99% of the people would say blue line. Okay? So these are the numbers for the Piper, but they're similar to Beechcraft. So blue line's an interesting answer. I've seen a lot of people try to establish blue line when they're doing these engine failure simulations. We're doing them up at altitude. The problem with trying to establish blue line is that almost every pilot I see who tries to establish blue line pitches the airplane too much and goes above blue line on airspeed. And every not you get, cost you altitude when you can least afford it. So you need to consider, what are you giving up to get to blue line? And do you absolutely have to be at blue line? And the answer is you don't have to be at blue line. You're not going to die. There's other airspeeds that we know to be safe. For example, VXSE, which is best angle, 82 knots. It's published and safe. So that airspeed will clearly be a safe one to fly. Now, if I tell people that there's a tree, they'll always say VXSE. But let's think about it. Isn't the ground an obstacle? If we know this airplane, until the prop is feathered, is going down, the ground is an obstacle. You're trying to clear an obstacle. So blue line doesn't even make sense. And again, every bit of pitch that you do to achieve blue line or VXSE, you're giving up some altitude. All right, so let's keep thinking about this. "56 knots, that's VMC in this airplane. All right, now we're in really dangerous territory. So nobody's going to suggest VMC as an airspeed. VMC is the minimum control speed with an engine, the critical engine failed. So might as well get into what we talk about on VMC at this point. VMC, you have to be able to define it and then tell me how you'd recognize it. Well, you run out of rudder. That's the big thing. You run out of rudder and you can't make the airplane go straight anymore. So is it always, and if it's a min control speed, then you're in control according to Piper with the certification limits. You're in control at 56 and out of control at 55 according to Piper. Is it always 55 knots where you're going to lose directional control? No. On the day that I gave you the high density altitude problem, it's going to be lower than that. And the reason it's lower is because the engine that's producing power is not producing as much power, so it's not pulling as hard. So it'll actually get VMC lower. So if VMC is 40, are we safer in this airplane? And the answer is absolutely not, because we're below stall speed. So we have to consider what's more dangerous, getting below VMC if you're not stalled, or stalling the airplane single engine. Well, if you stall the airplane single engine with one wing having an engine blowing air over the wing, the other one doesn't, there's no way that this is going to turn out to be a coordinated event. So it's going to be a spin if you get into a fully developed stall. So the stall is to be avoided even more than VMC. Unfortunately, in these trainers, these things are happening simultaneously. So we got to avoid VMC. We have to understand how it changes with atmospheric conditions. So we know VMC is not a safe speed. So perhaps there's something in between 82 and 56, which would be safe enough. The best way to handle this is to pitch the plane in level flight, at least in these trainers. I don't know if it's true in all aircraft because this is my experience. Pitch the plane for level flight. You'll get about 75 to 80 knots. And as soon as the prop feathers, that will accelerate to about, well, certainly 82, and maybe even blue line. And if you pitch the plane to level flight attitude, you haven't given up any altitude in order to maintain as whatever you achieved before the engine failed. So this is a little bit of heresy in the multi-engine community, but if you pitch the plane for level flight, you will not scare the examiner, and you probably won't hit the tree. The people, as I said, who go for blue line will always overshoot it, and they will lose 150 feet. And I only gave them 200 feet to handle the emergency. The people who pitch to a level flight attitude lose 0 feet. Even though the plane shouldn't be climbing, at least it's not losing altitude, which is your main goal until the prop feathers. So the profile we get, now don't think that you don't have to pitch the airplane. You have to pitch it. You can't hold the climb attitude and expect the airplane to keep flying without slowing dangerously slow. So level flight is the attitude. You'll get a safe enough airspeed, and you'll probably miss the tree. So in my example here, This is the area where the pilot is trying to maintain what altitude he has achieved, and then he's starting his dramatic 80 foot per minute climb over here, and he's probably going to get past the tree. Whereas another pilot who went for blue line may be going down here, and he won't clear the tree. So that's one of the main things I've learned through observation on giving these check rides. Let's go back to, okay.
From the teaching standpoint, would you want to emphasize that pitching for level right off the bat, or start with 88 as they get more comfortable with procedures? Say, you know what, really, actually make it up an obstacle. Why don't you try this?
Well, I would think that you can easily make the argument for VXSE, because the ground is an obstacle. So that would be a baseline, and certainly a very healthy airspeed. So there doesn't have to be a tree to justify 82 or VXSE. There is a little bit of a hazard if you don't, certainly there's a big hazard if you don't tell them to pitch down. But you've seen this, I know, where you pitch the airplane, go for blue line, you get to 100, and then you eat up 200 feet, and that's all you had to begin with. So I'm a little reluctant to say go out there and preach 75, because that's not really what I'm trying to say. I'm saying maintain what you've got, and it'll probably be safe enough if you pitch for level flight. And if you watch it evolve, you'll see that I was checking when the weather got cold to see what airspeed you get with the Piper. And if you pitch it for level flight, you get about 80. Feather the prop, it's 88. You're there, and you didn't lose any altitude. So you can, I haven't been teaching in a while, so I don't know what their behavior would be. I think at least if they pitch level, I don't think they're going to be in too much trouble. So anybody have any other experiences with that? Okay. So that brings us back to our perfect upwind. This is what I replace mixture prop throttle with. First of all, mixture prop throttle, you should have taken care of that before you took off. Otherwise, you didn't plan your takeoff very well. The other downside of that mixture prop throttle is if you took off in Denver and it was hot out, you had to lean the mixture for best performance. If you're a student who now owns a twin and flies out to Denver routinely, goes into the rope behavior mixture prop throttle, he's slamming the mixture forward, and he's going to kill the remaining engine. So that would be dangerous. So you want to verify that the power is set. If you've already reduced the power, you have enough altitude where you have some time to consider all these other things. You're probably out of the danger zone because you'd be at 500 or 1,000 feet if you made a power reduction and you needed to power up. So verify the power is set. Identify, this is dead foot, dead engine, and especially, well, clearly it's going to be VFR. God forbid this should happen to somebody who climbed into a 100-foot overcast. But step on the ball or keep the heading visually, which is easy enough to do. Identify dead foot, dead engine. It's very important, I think, to take the extra second and either slap your leg or say it out loud or both. Left foot, left engine. Left foot dead, left engine's dead. So you identify that way. You verify it by pulling a throttle back. Now, how would we know if we pulled the wrong throttle? We'd know if there was a change in yaw. A lot of people want to say they would know because the performance would change. Trust me, people do not recognize a change in performance. People say they would notice a change in sound. Well, I do, but if you're nervous, and a lot of applicants are nervous, they can feather an engine and sit around for many, many seconds not realizing that they had feathered the wrong engine. So the sound isn't a good indication, and the performance isn't a good indication, because how are you going to measure that? Are you going to look at the VSI and wait for that to settle down? So really, the only thing that you really know for sure is that there's a change in the yaw. If there's a change in the yaw, what would you do with that engine, or that throttle? Well, you'd put that throttle full forward again, because it was maybe the wrong engine. what would you do then? Well, maybe I'd pull the other throttle thinking I made a mistake. Well, what if you got a change in the yaw when you pulled the other throttle? What would you do with that throttle? Well, put it back forward, because you're too close to the ground to be trying to figure this out. So what's probably happening is you have partial power, and you wouldn't want to give that up. If it's giving you half the power, you still want to use it till you get some altitude. So use everything you've got and be able to recognize a partial power loss. I realized this was a big gap in the training, and this is where rote behavior can get people into trouble. It was one of the most scary experiences I had on a check ride. I was rolling down the runway at Milwaukee, and it always happens on the shortest runway facing the trees. Something's going to happen, you know. The applicant had not secured the door properly. It wasn't a trick on my part. It's an old door, and it didn't secure properly. And I didn't even know it. So as we're rolling down the runway, the door cracked open a little bit. So I figured, oh, this is great. You know, here's a real event. I get to watch the guy actually behave as he would in the real world, thinking he would abort the takeoff. And he didn't. So I didn't want him to get airborne, and a few seconds later I said, the door's open, and he ignored me. And then we get airborne, and the door comes open another foot. Well, this caused his feet to get into the act. He's pressing on one of the rudders because the door is open on the right side. It's obvious the door is open. Huge noise. Anybody who's been in one knows that this is very noisy. It's really evident the door is open. Plus the examiner is screaming in the microphone, it's just the door, it's just the door. And this pilot absolutely was going to feather an engine because his feet got involved. And it was me physically prying his hands off the prop to keep him from feathering an engine as we're looking at the trees and about 50 feet in the air. So I was thinking, what happened to this guy? Well, clearly it was rote behavior that he trotted out for the wrong situation. And he would have killed himself, I'm sure, in those trees because he would have feathered an engine. And who knows, I'm sure that plane wasn't going to clear the trees in that given scenario. So I started thinking about this, and I realized that that kind of mimics a partial power loss. So if you had a partial power loss, you might get your feet involved a little bit, just like the asymmetric drag he had with the door being open. And here's a guy who, as soon as his feet were activated, he was going to feather an engine. So we must train people to recognize that if you have power, even if your feet are involved, it could be a control surface problem, or it could be partial power in one of the engines, but not to go ahead and feather. So we have to take this a little more systematically than just boom, boom, boom. So talk about the partial power and consider that as a potential, at least discussion item. There's almost no way to simulate that in flight on these training exercises, so that's kind of a drawback. All right, so where are we here? Okay, so if we actually find that one of the engines is producing no power, we're going to feather the engine. Now I notice that I put verify gear up after feathering the engine. Another little act of heresy on my part. But remember, we said that the gear going up was a very important landmark. So the reason you're still flying is because you put the gear up, right? That's the only reason you're still flying, otherwise you would have landed the airplane. So if you're doing this correctly, the gear is up. And by the time the prop is feathered, you can verify that you actually got the gear up. We already know that the windmilling prop causes you a greater drag than the gear being down anyway. Plus the gear provides a keel in the air, which is useful if you get it slower and slower. So having the gear down, although a bad operating practice at this moment, having the gear down is not as bad as having the prop windmilling. Now, obviously, most people check that the gear's up before they go to feather the prop. I have absolutely no objection to that because it's a drag element. You should be checking it. And frankly, I think it's useful because it gives you a couple seconds to get your head together. And you don't want to be pulling the wrong engine. So the moment that it takes to check that the gear is up, clearly there's no problem with you doing that. That's perfectly all right on a check ride. I would say 10 out of 10 applicants would check the gear first, so that's fun. Just talking about ideal world then. And then we have to climb as best we can and maintain our zero side slip and all those conditions that we talked about. So we know 82 is an airspeed that we desired, and if we have pitched the airplane for the best speed, by the time we feather the prop, we will, in fact, have achieved 88 in level flight, and perhaps even get a climb. So if we're at a tower, no, anywhere you are, you can notify whoever's listening to the tower or the traffic that there's an engine failure so that nobody's in your way for whatever you're going to try and do next. Now we need to assess the performance. It's possible that a given plane is not going to do book numbers on a given day, or it could be that you made a bad decision to take off. And now, if you're not climbing, you may have to just commit to landing somewhere straight ahead, just as you would in a single engine airplane. At least you'll be in the best configuration to maneuver to a suitable flat spot. You also want to consider the potential of going somewhere else. If you calculate that it's going to take you 5 miles to get to pattern altitude, if you took off on 3-4 at Milwaukee, you might be close to Waukegan and have not had to make any turns. So that could be a possibility. Now going the other direction, I would probably not go to O'Hare. But consider that there's a potential for going someplace else rather than making turns close to the ground. But obviously this is an emergency situation, so you get to do what you want to do. You're not rushed by the tower into doing anything. So we're assessing our performance and evaluating how much altitude we have to get. Now we're going to try to get to pattern altitude, probably at least to circling altitudes, 600-700 feet should be enough altitude to make you safe, and fly a traffic pattern. Now we get to talk about which way you're going to turn. Everybody says you're going to turn into a good engine. And then a lot of them don't know why, but they know that they're supposed to turn into a good engine. Well, the answer is really kind of simple. If you turn into the dead engine, you're helping the airplane to kill you. It's trying to roll you over that way, and you'd be helping it out. So we don't need a fancy aerodynamic discussion here. We just need to know that you understand that if you're turning into the dead engine, that's the way it's likely to roll you. But it's also important to know that that isn't a hard and fast rule. I had one applicant who was incapable of getting into a traffic pattern because he would not turn into a dead engine. And so even though I had the outside engine fail, so the right engine in the left traffic pattern, he was on a 45 and momentarily he had to turn into that dead engine. And he was frightened to death for doing that because his instructor hadn't clarified to him when it's safe to turn into the dead engine. So there's 2 conditions that make it safe. Does anybody want to volunteer the 2 things that can make it safe to turn into the dead engine?
Speed and altitude.
Speed and altitude. Very good answer. If you have enough speed, it doesn't matter which way you turn. Very good and very fast. But if you have 100 knots, you can turn any way you want. It doesn't make any difference. Now the other one's really kind of hard. But picture yourself with an engine failure at 5,000 feet above DeKalb. Picture, what about that scenario might make it safe to turn into that engine?
Pull the power play.
Right, exactly, very good. If you pull the power on the operating engine, it's not asymmetric anymore. You can turn any way you want. So if you have enough airspeed and altitude, and or the power isn't asymmetrical, you can turn any way you want. All right, that's our perfect upwind. And as I say, it's kind of a conceptual perfect upwind. I don't expect any instructors to be delaying them, checking the gear being up. It's certainly fine to check the gear off. It sure is important that you discuss whether or not there's any power or some other problem that's causing you to be off. That's important. But I think we can skip slamming the mixtures forward and putting the power forward. So we want to kind of simplify that and get it down to the fewest seconds possible. Okay, so that's our upwind. emergency. And we have to talk about how we're going to get back to the airport. Oh, let's talk a little bit more about accelerate go. Another way to figure out accelerate go. We know a couple of facts about the airplane, and that is that it takes 1,500 feet of ground roll. Okay, let's evaluate what we're really talking about. This is sort of an idealized picture of the takeoff. Like I said, the airplane has the engine failure at the end of the area of decision and does everything right and flies right over the tree. And it doesn't really happen. We actually have more of this scenario where the airplane descends for a while and then starts climbing. Now we can attach some numbers to the distances involved here. Okay, if you decide you're going to fly the airplane, a number of things have to happen to get the airplane into a condition to climb. There are human factors. There's always the uh-oh factor, like this can't be happening. I have to deal with this. So that could take you 1 to several seconds to accept the fact that it's happening and fly the airplane with the control input in there, pitch for level flight, and you have a couple seconds that it's going to take you to identify, verify, and tell. And we do want you to take a couple seconds to make this happen so that you don't get the wrong one. You don't want to rush through this stuff. So we have to take a couple of seconds to make sure we get this right. So we have some human factors. Now we have mechanical factors that even Superman can't do any better than. The gear will take 6 seconds to cycle, but then you made a bad decision because you should have been landing at this point. The prop takes 6 seconds to feather. That's going to take anybody 6 seconds to get the prop feathered. So the time until the airplane commences a climb is usually going to be somewhere in the 10 to 15 second range. Now, if we're flying at 82 knots and you do the math, the plane is traveling 138 feet per second, or covers somewhere in this 1,400 to 2,000 foot distance. And that's a lot of distance to be covering in 10 to 15 seconds. If you're going 75, pitch for level flight scenario, you're not moving as fast, so you're not eating up as much ground, but it's still 1,200 to 1,900 feet in 10 to 15 seconds. Once you get the plane into a condition to climb, if we have the appalling 100-foot per minute climb rate we had on this high-density altitude day, we still have to climb for 30 seconds to clear the tree. 30 seconds more is another 4,000 feet. So you have 1,500 foot of ground roll, 1,300 feet to get the plane cleaned up in a condition to fly, 4,000 feet, clear the tree. This is on a really bad day. And so it amounts to 7,000 feet before you can hope to clear the tree. Not a good thing when you think about it. So when we look at our diagram of what we hope to be reality, there's your 1,500 feet. We don't know how much time, how much distance it took to get this much altitude. We didn't compute that. But we know we're going to have to add the 1,300 feet while he's cleaning it up and the 4,000 feet to clear the tree. So either there better not be a tree out there, or you better be committed to finding your way through them, because it's going to, or at least hope that you achieved 100 feet here, and then just maintain while you're trying to fly your way out of the situation. So if you do the math, this is how it comes out. There's no way around it. All the time you're fooling around, all the time you're going through your procedures, you're traveling over the ground. And you've already used up as much ground as it took you to get to that altitude. So it's not as optimistic as some people would like to think. All right, any questions so far? Okay. All right. Now we'll talk about how I do the simulations. A lot of people have all sorts of different techniques. Oh, actually, I should go back and talk about the cruise engine problems. In cruise, we have the luxury of altitude and airspeed. So when you're asked how you're going to handle a cruise engine failure differently, if at all, you obviously have time to make some decisions. If the performance is there, then you will continue with, turn this off. If you're in cruise and you have the altitude and your workload is not high, that is, you're not in IMC about to start an ILS, you have time, it's a nice day, you have enough altitude, and you're able to maintain level or a slight drift down that you can tolerate, some troubleshooting might be in order. Now, the kind of scenario where troubleshooting would be very valuable would be a fuel mismanagement type of situation. Perhaps carburetor icing. But the answer to the question, well, how do you handle it differently, is you take some time. So, sure, you want to get best power out of it. You can do that kind of methodically and go forward on that. You know, if it's a turbocharger bearing, maybe you don't have to slam the throttles, go forward, but get some power so you can maintain at least what you've got. Identify and verify the engine. And before you feather, you got to think fix or feather. Is this a situation that I might be able to fix? So again, you assess what kind of situation it is. If the engine's on fire, you can't fix it. And slamming the mixture board probably didn't help that situation. So this is not a fix or feather situation. If it's making horrible clanking noises, it's probably not a fix or feather situation. And remember, you got to feather before the stop pins drop in, so you know, consider that if the engine is slowing down. But if it's the sort of thing where you might have mismanaged the fuel, or you know, test the examiner, turn the fuel selector off, you can certainly do some research. Now, how do we do this? Well, really, what you're looking for on a fix or feather is fuel, air, and spark issues. So you can do this from memory, because air to the engine is a carburetor heat issue, or maybe alternate air. Fuel, mixtures, fuel selectors, fuel pumps. And sparks, check the magneto's are on. The Seminole, actually, the older model Seminole with the fuel pumps over here, left and right, I've had an applicant turn off left and right, and he shut an engine down. It was on the ground, thank God. But he thought he was turning the fuel pumps off. So it is possible that you could have shut mags off and put the fuel pumps on. Anyway, so you want to check the fuel, air, and spark issues. And if you have time and you're maintaining, you might even get out the checklist. But during a check ride, I would think that a memory checklist that covered all the items would be adequate. Where do you want the throttle on the suspected dead engine while you're troubleshooting? Well, if you did your identify, verify, it's at idle. You can go through your troubleshoot. You could even solve your problem and not know that you get the engine back. So it's important when you're doing the troubleshooting to make sure you open the throttle. Very important. It's not that the engine won't start with the windmilling prop and idle. It will start as soon as you reintroduce fuel or whatever is missing. But it may not show you that it started. You can't tell that it started because windmilling and idle sounds the same, exactly the same in the airplane. So if I'm conducting a simulation and I shut off the fuel selectors, you're dutifully doing your troubleshooting, and you get to the fuel pumps and you put them on. I'll put the fuel selector back on, and you may not notice that the engine is running, and you keep doing your troubleshooting, and you say, okay, she's not giving it back to me. Then you say, I'm going to feather. I'll say, okay, so you think it's not running. Why is it not running? What do you think I've done? Well, you turn the fuel selector off, and they'll look and see that the fuel selectors are now both on, and they're dumbfounded, you know, and it's just simply because they didn't have the throttle open. So you need to open the throttle at least a quarter travel so that you can detect the change in yaw when the engine comes back. So do the troubleshooting when it's appropriate. I would also ask, when would you not troubleshoot? We already covered some of those. If it's on fire, if it's making horrible noises, if the oil is coming out of it, zero oil pressure and temperature's rising. So then you have to do, in those situations, you'd have to do a precautionary shutdown. People are very unwilling to give up an engine that's producing power, even when it's on clearly its last legs. A friend of mine was coming, I took him out to the paint shop to bring his plane back from Iowa, and we're flying next to each other talking, and the paint shop had done a lot of work on the airplane. And on the way back, beautiful brand new painted Baron, it's leaking fuel over the left cowling of the engine. Big fuel leak, blue fuel coming out over the engine. I'm in the other airplane, and he refuses to shut the engine down, and I'm thinking this is a fire waiting to happen. So it made it clear to me that he was really, really unwilling to give up the engine, even in the face of a potential disaster like that. And luckily, he didn't burn himself out, but that's the kind of psychology that you might expect with people. So you must teach precautionary shutdowns to students, and you must be ready to accept the concept of having to do a precautionary shutdown. So to do this, for training or for testing, you can just simply tell a story, because it's hard to create this sort of scenario where the engine's on fire and make it believable. So you can say, of course, if I say the engine's on fire, then we do the emergency descent. Then we get into a whole different story. But let's say that oil pressure is 0 and temperatures are rising. What are you going to do? So I'm going to do a precautionary shutdown. Right, well, what's the best way to do this? Well, if the oil pressure is 0, and you first put all the levers forward, when you put that prop lever forward, you're asking for more oil for the prop. And you're about going to make the engine seize on the spot if you do that. So slamming all the levers forward wasn't a really good idea to get the power out of the good engine. So what you really needed to do is put the levers forward on the good engine. So you want to do it in the right order. You want to go mixture, prop, throttle. That way you get the power that you need out of the good engine, and then you shut down the bad engine, throttle, prop, mixture. That way you haven't asked the engine to do more, you haven't slammed more fuel into a burning engine, and saved yourself a lot of headaches. Now, so the way you want to train this is good, 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 bad, bad, bad. People seem to buy into that and remember how to do that just fine. I wouldn't fail somebody who put everything forward, but we have a little discussion about the potential negative consequences of doing that. So on the precautionary shutdown, that's how you want to accomplish that. And like I say, people don't accept the fact that they might have to shut down an engine that's running, so be sure you get your students thinking about the potential of having to do that. All right, so let's say now that you're going to have to come back and land the airplane. How are we going to do this traffic pattern? Well, you'd like to make the turns into the good engine, and since it's an emergency, you can always request that. So you request the turns into the good engine, or be very, very cautious if you're turning into the dead engine for some inexplicable reason. So how do you reconfigure the airplane? Well, this is all based on performance, how the plane is performing. A lot of people say they're going to wait until they have the field made, until they put the gear down and the flaps in. Well, that raises the question, how are you defining making the field? Are you saying if the other engine quits, you could glide to the field? Well, we don't. These planes don't glide very far, so that's not what we're talking about. So what you really want to assess is, can I afford to put the gear down now? By the way, if you wait until you're 100 feet on final, you go to put the gear down. What if it doesn't come down? Now you're at 100 feet and you found this out, or 200 feet. Maybe with no ability to climb. So now you're researching this gear problem at 100 or 200 feet. Very bad situation. So we'd like to get the gear down in a place where it's going to be, at least give us an opportunity to assess what we need to do. If it was an Aztec and you feathered the left engine and you forgot that now you've got to pump the gear down, at least you have the altitude because you reminded yourself why you went down there. So the answer to the question is when you put the gear down, when you want to go down. If the plane's maintaining level flight, putting the gear down will probably be just the ticket for starting down. So it could be being the numbers. If that wouldn't be, if you can't expect to maintain the performance to get to the runway, then you might delay until base leg for the gear. We all agree, I think, that we should reserve the flaps until final because you can land without the flaps. It's not like the gear. And the flaps add quite a bit of drag and certainly would kill the performance so much that these light twins are not really able to get to the runway in one engine. At least on a hot day at gross weight. So, answer is gear down when you want to go down. So that would be final approach fix inbound or a beam in numbers. And flaps on final. And what's the profile for airspeed? You want the airspeed to be about as normal as possible. Blue line somewhere in there where you normally find final. The reason, and you want to be at the same, at the correct altitude as well. Normal altitude, you don't want to be too high. The reason is that when you land, the fact that you have a prop feather reduces the drag profile of the airplane quite a bit. So the feathered prop is going to cause you to float more. And if you start, so the float will be a surprise to you anyway. And if you add the extra altitude and potentially extra airspeed that some people think offers a margin of safety, you can float down the length of the runway. I saw one applicant who, on a simulated zero thrust landing, used up just about all of 2.7 at DeKalb, which is not a pretty picture. That's a real long runway. So he was floating quite a long distance, and so you could actually get the airplane to the airport and then hit the fence at the far end of the runway if you don't handle the profile right, and that would be very embarrassing. Okay, the other thing that's different about these landings is you will have the differential drag when instead of differential thrust, where you're holding your foot into the good engine. When you windmill that engine, when you pull that engine back to idle, that's going to be producing drag. And now the feathered prop or the simulated feathered prop produces less drag, so you actually have a rudder shift, unless the crosswind is on one or the other side of the I can never figure it out. But the crosswind could end up making the rudder input be the same, but in general you're going to have a rudder shift as you touch down. And people notice that and they straighten it out, so it's just interesting to know academically that that's because of the asymmetric drag. Okay, so we went through all the engine failures. Now we'll talk about the simulations. Okay, this is how I do it. It isn't the only way, but it's the safe ways to do things, and I think one of my goals is to try and make it as realistic as possible. So on the takeoff roll, when you lose an engine, it's going to feel asymmetric to you. It'll start to steer off to one side. One technique that people use is to pull a throttle back. Well, this is pretty obvious to the student what's happening. He knows he's going to reach for the other throttle. The downside of that, I saw this happen the other day. It was the first time, but it doesn't mean it won't happen again. The applicant was trying to figure out which was the good throttle to pull back on the runway. So he was trying to figure out which one to pull back. So if you pull one throttle and he's only having to pull one throttle on the takeoff roll, you might encourage that kind of foolish behavior. All you want to do is pull both throttles back. So I don't like the throttle technique. A lot of people use the mixture. I've embarrassed myself at Midway in Milwaukee with the engine quitting on the runway, so that may not be the most favorable way to do it. And it's pretty obvious to the student. So the very best technique that I've found is to use drag the brake or the rudder. So if you just exert a little pressure on the on one side or the other, try not to do it into the wind because then you're rudder vaning and steering it into the wind. But this gives you the most control as an instructor over the event because your feet are already up there. If he fails to do what he's supposed to do, you can steer it the way it has to go. You can also release the brake instantly if you don't get the response out of him. And he's absolutely clueless that it's about to happen. Be sure you brief your students on this beforehand so that they know what that feels like. It isn't exactly like the engine quit, but it feels somewhat similar. So dragging the brake or the rudder a little bit. And remember, this has to happen below 50% of Vmc. So the airspeed indicator is not off peg yet. This can be scary if you go too fast and do this. I had an MEI one time, and I said, give me this engine failure on the takeoff roll. And we were in a Duchess. And I'm barreling down the runway, and I figured he's forgotten to do this because we're way past the speed. So we get to rotate speed, and this guy stomps on the brake. And I'm heading toward the lights. I have a picture of that light I was going toward. And fortunately, there was enough airspeed to get the airplane airborne. But this is supposed to be done at 50% of Vmc and no faster. I do it at the very beginning. It's not worth it to me to get 25 or 30 knots into it before we lose. The ATPs do an abort. They don't have an engine failure necessarily. They do an abort for some other reason. So this is the I smell smoke story, or and you know, you gotta mix it up a little bit. So I decided I was bored with saying I smell smoke at one flight school, and I said, "What's that clanking noise from over there?" And he didn't recognize this as a cue to abort the engine, abort the takeoff. But I mean, a clanking noise on takeoff should mean something. So I decided to mix it up a lot. And, oh my God, is that a rat in the back seat? You know, so now they, you know, they do a special pre-flight for roads. But mix it up a little bit, you know, make it believable. Or, oh, geez, I don't think the door is closed. You know, just make it kind of as real life as you can when you're giving these stories. The upwind emergency, this is clearly where we lose a lot of flight instructors. I don't do this on upwind. I do this in simulated upwind. So I give an artificial floor, you know, somewhere 4,000, 4,200 feet. Say this is the field elevation. Get the airplane in takeoff configuration like you just lifted off the ground. So we're going to start it with the gear down. Takeoff configuration, full power. I'm going to cover up the mixtures because if you don't cover up the mixtures and do it, they just match them up. You know, so they haven't learned to figure out which one to pull. So you got to cover up the mixtures. So cover up the mixtures. Anyway, the way this goes, they get into the 80s on a sunroll, somewhere in the 80s, full power, they're climbing up. They're going to accelerate to blue line and continue to climb. And I brief them on that. Clearly at 50 or 100 feet, you'd be putting the gear up. So they put the gear up, and at about a 200-foot window, I pull one of the mixtures. Then they have to get through the procedures, fly the airplane within this 200-foot window. And this is where I learned that pitching for level flight, you lose 0 altitude. Pitching for blue line, 150 to 200 feet. Because they overshoot blue line every time, and they gave up altitude to get that. So, and typically that's where I do a full feather, because you want to reinforce the feathering behavior for this particular emergency. So if you're going to, you know, since you have to teach full feathers, might as well do it in a scenario where it'd be most meaningful to them to have that built behavior built in. Let's see, so that's on the upwind. Now, for somebody who was a little rocky on their simulated engine failure at altitude, simulating takeoff at altitude, I might do it closer to the ground. And you will find other examiners who do it closer to the ground. But I'm very, very cautious about this. So we'll get, you know, if it was a little uncertain on the one that I just described, maybe in the traffic pattern I'll say, we might have an engine failure on climb up this time. And I make it very, very obvious this is happening. We get to about 400 feet, and I say, all right, you're going to have a serious problem now, and I pull one of the throttles back. This will show me whether he's going to pitch the airplane for the appropriate pitch, airspeed, and if he'll maintain directional control. So you can do it 400 or 500 feet in the air. But truly, I think the safest thing to do is at altitude with the simulated ground elevation. Cruise emergency. We talked about the troubleshooting scenarios and how to prompt them into getting that. You know, if you shut off the fuel selector, it's a bigger surprise. If you can get to it, it's a little harder in the Duchesses, but if you shut off the fuel selector, you can usually surprise them. And what's good to do, because it helps in their training and their ability to interpret what to do with their feet, start them in a clearing turn. This is what I do. You know, let's clear the area. When I fail an engine while they're in the clearing turn, it's going to take a few seconds to fail anyway. And then they have to, whoa, wait, what's going on? The silliest behavior is the people who continue the clearing turn and try to do this. Shows that they're not on top of the program yet. But, you know, they'll level the wings, they'll sort out what they need to do. If they put the wrong foot in, they can check the ball and get their feet straightened out, and then get into a troubleshoot situation. We talked about the precautionary shutdown and how to handle that. And again, the best way to train people to do that is if you're going to do it, you tell them a story that fails an engine, and they go, good, 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 mixture prop, throttle, and bad, 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 throttle, prop, mixture. If they don't do it in that order, if they simply shut down the other engine without powering up the good engine, what you'll see them do is when they find they haven't got enough power, they'll open the throttle up, but then the prop's not forward, so they're not going to get full power. So then you have to say, well, you might be using the prop a little bit. So you really want them to power up the good engine first and then shut down the bad engine. We have, anybody who wants instrument privileges has to have an engine failure in cruise flight. It's good to do it both ways. You can tell the story and lead them into a precautionary shutdown while they're under the hood. Or you can fail the engine with a mixture if you're going to do an ILS, or however you want to do it. But you want them to be able to figure out which foot to use, and that's when they need to go and look at the ball. Because they're not, people will say, oh, look at the heading indicator, and none of that is as needed as looking at the ball. So there will be an engine failure in instrument conditions, which would probably lead into the single engine approach, ILS, or what have you. And for the airplanes that you're doing training, you'll figure out typical power settings and how to handle that so that they get to where they want to be in the instrument approach. Traffic pattern for your students, and since normally it's an emergency when you have to land with an engine failure, you can always set it up so that the outside engine is the engine that's failed, so left traffic would be the right engine that's failed. That way you have the assurance that they're flying, making the turns into a good engine. If the tower changes the traffic pattern and you don't want to make a fuss about we need to go the other direction, you can watch them and see if they maintain a healthy enough airspeed to be turning into the dead engine. There's, no harm in doing that, but, on the brand new students who are just doing these traffic patterns for the first time, you want to watch out. One of the big problems in these traffic patterns is there's a tendency for people to not use all the power they have available for some reason. So they'll be maintaining blue line, but then they start doing turns. Well, if you start doing turns, you're going to lose blue line, perhaps. And if we start sinking or losing airspeed, and they have power left over, it makes me wonder if they would ever use all the power, because we shouldn't be getting below blue line or losing altitude when we don't want to if there's power available. So you don't want to use 20 inches for a single engine landing, because then they're going to take their Checkride on a hot day, and 20 inches isn't going to be enough. So the answer is whatever you need to maintain the performance. It's an emergency. Run that engine at full power if you have to. These trainers, are fairly sturdy engines, and you can do that. So make sure they use enough power to get around without scaring the examiner or potentially hurting themselves in their way. Obviously, we're not anticipating any going around. Piper, interestingly enough, says they want you to use 2 notches of flaps on a single engine landing because in the event you have to go around, you don't want to have full flaps. This is a little optimistic. Full flaps is appropriate. If I see somebody in a Seminole using 2 notches, he can defend his position by pointing to the manual, so I'd say okay, but realistically you want to reduce the float, so you want to have full flaps. And remember that the majority of problems with these engine failures is getting into a situation where you mishandle the simulation, the potential problem, so badly that the outcome of the maneuver became seriously in doubt. So that's one of the big reasons that people would fail this is bad procedures and basically scaring the examiner or potentially hurting themselves in real life. So if you can avoid scaring the examiner and your training is complete, you can probably survive these things. in real life. So that's pretty much all I have, unless anybody has questions. Yes?
You're doing a single engine department. When do you want to say this? Let's say they come up first. You're trimmed off this, trim the airline. When do you want to send one truck? Because when you bring a throttle back, you're going to get it.
Frankly, I think people should be able, for as long as they're going to have to hold the control input, I'd like to see them not do all that trimming, because it's just going to make the landing very confusing. In fact, unless I had many miles to go, in reality, if I had an engine failure, I'd probably just hold the control input that I need to. So few people actually trim the rudder that I don't have an opinion on that. Yes, it's going to make the landing confusing when the rudder shifts around, but I don't know exactly what pitfalls people fall into from that. I can see the potential for it, but I haven't seen it in action. Well, that's true. That's true. I think at that point, then on touchdown, then you're just compelled to use what you have to use and not be fussing with the trim. I would think at that point, it's, why bother taking the trim out? If they can and they're deft at it and they're not distracted from the landing itself, then fine. Anybody else? Okay, like I said, a lot of this stuff is a little bit off the beaten path, and we still ask people, what airspeed should you be flying on upwind with an engine failure? You probably get blue line 99 times out of 100. And that, like I say, if during the practical test, they go for blue line, achieve blue line, and don't hit the simulated ground, I have to pass it. I can't say they failed, but if you got within 50 feet of the ground and you should have been 200 feet above the ground, you didn't do the absolute best job you could. Thank you very much.